Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of Black Hat, Singapore. I hope you had a good time last night. It was fantastic at the MBS here. Had some great meals, some great conversations. The reception was really good, place to connect. And we're going to have another closing session this evening I'll tell you about a little bit later. But first, I just want to talk a little bit about people and processes. And as you're at the day sessions and you're learning about a lot of technical, hyper-technical sessions, solutions, vulnerabilities, just think a little bit about your people, your processes, and the tools you have them using. Because today, for our keynote session, we're going to be talking about a bit about people and technology and measurement. And you're trying to find that fit between how do you create a right-sized spend to have an effective team, and to do that you're going to need some sort of measurements or metrics. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to introduce a large supporter of Black Hat, Sneak. Sneak's head of solutions engineering, Lawrence Crowther, is going to get up and talk a little bit about developer-focused security, your people, your processes. And there's this accelerating trend as I talked a little bit yesterday about speed. As we speed up, or as we are forced to speed up, some of these cycles are accelerating. Things that used to be 2 separate processes are being forced together to become one process. And what does that mean, right? If security engineers have to essentially become developers, or developers have to become security engineers, or certain things are collapsing, what does that mean? So it's my pleasure to introduce Lawrence Crowther. Give us some thoughts on this. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. I appreciate that. Welcome, everyone. I want to ask you a question. Should we trust developers to handle security? And if we do, should we allow them to also download various open source code and include it in our own software supply chain, when we know as security professionals it's probably riddled with vulnerabilities? Now, let's just say we can't trust developers. What does that look like? Well, it would mean we would have to trust the security team to handle it all. They don't have the bandwidth nor the resources, and they would become the bottleneck. And if we lock everything down and don't let developers bring in open source, they would need to create everything from scratch and create more first-party custom or proprietary code, which would probably contain just the same number of vulnerabilities, if not more. So you haven't really achieved anything there. So I argue that you should trust developers to handle security, and furthermore, if you don't, your company may be left behind, and you could put your company at risk. So there's 3 fundamental reasons why I think you should trust developers to handle security. Number 1 is simply the pace of innovation. Security teams just can't keep up with the pace of developers. Number 2 is that the ratio of developers to security expert in some companies is like 100 to 1. I've seen some organizations where there's 100 developers to every 1 application security expert, and that simply doesn't scale. And then finally, as we know, everything is software. Your network, your infrastructure, your cloud, your configuration. And the trend is for developers to create and manage all those components using infrastructure as code. So it kind of makes sense for them to also secure those components, right? Now, I think that it may cause some friction between the development and security teams with this sort of extra burden that developers now have with the additional responsibility. But I think that if you find the right balance between speed and safety, between the development and security teams, I think both teams will benefit. I mean, of course, good tooling always helps, right? It's going to help remove some of that burden from developers, remove a lot of the heavy lifting, and make them more productive. If you want developers to actually adopt security tools, it needs to actually look like a developer tool, something that developers understand and can integrate into their own workflow, less like a traditional security tool. What does all this mean for security folks? Well, if you buy into the sort of popular idea that all companies are software companies, everyone's shifting to the cloud, then the intersection of apps and cloud is where security needs to focus. Now, within the organization, you should try and align the security team, which traditionally has been aligned with central IT, with a development organization. For example, you can assign one AppSec person, let's say, with multiple development teams and have them embedded in the projects, and they can have a partner to reach out to for advice and guidance around securing their software. But I think ultimately it's going to come down to both the security teams and the development teams working together to take responsibility of security. For developers, this looks like being thoughtful about security first, feeling empowered to own security. And for security teams, it means no longer being that sort of controlling or gating function, but more playing the supportive and guidance type role to enable developers to actually fix security issues themselves. Now, I want to leave you with the fact that in Asia Pacific and Japan, there's a massive opportunity in this space because we have 2/3 of the world's developers. We also have a shortage of cybersecurity experts. So it kind of makes sense for more companies to sort of lean in on a developer-first security approach. Something to think about as you attend the sessions here on day 2 of the conference and as you're having discussions out in the business hall. Thank you very much and enjoy day 2 of the conference.
Thank you. All right, we're going to move into our main keynote session right now. It's going to be my pleasure to introduce you to the day 2 keynote, George Do. Now, George is the Chief Information Security Officer at Gojek and GoTo Financial. Like me, he's kind of transplanted from North America. He has deep industry experience. I'll just tell you a little bit about his work history, which is very impressive, and it shows you the technical and the sort of boardroom skills necessary to advance to this level. He was a Chief Security Officer at Equinix, where he built the global cybersecurity program from the ground up. So from nothing to something, right? That's a certain skill set that's very important. He previously worked at Exodus, which is also known as CISO or CenturyLink, another large provider, bandwidth provider, infrastructure provider. And so when I say infrastructure provider, what I'm also hinting at is regulation, governance, right? It's not a standalone company. It's interconnected with everything. And I was a financial supporter of one of his companies before that, TiVo. Now, for many people, you might not remember TiVo, but it's the original digital DVR recorder, and that's how I consumed my media in the early days before pervasive streaming was TiVo, where he also had security leadership roles. And he started off at NASA, the United States NASA, where he worked with the federal government to try to secure NASA assets. So a broad range of private and governmental experience, and working from the trenches to the boardroom. And it's appropriate that his keynote is going to be talking about quantifying security metrics, moving the security needle from the trenches to the boardroom. You can't really act on something if you can't measure it. So with that said, it is my pleasure to introduce George Do.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Jeff, for the gracious introduction. I'm super happy to be here. Happy Friday. I think some of us made it out, and maybe some of us had a late night, so we could make it out this morning. But hopefully you are having a great Black Hat session. Okay? So I'm here to share with you my experience. You know, I've been doing security for a long time, and I've had my share of battle scars. And my goal today is to share with you what I've learned throughout my journey. And one of the biggest learnings I've had throughout my career has been, how do you really know you're moving to security needle? All of your investments, all of your hiring, all of your projects, all of the blood, sweat, and tears that the security staff puts into the trenches, does it matter? Is it moving the needle? Is it meaningful, right? So I'm going to start Friday with a Dilbert cartoon. give everybody a second to read what this Dilbert cartoon is saying. By show of hands in the audience, who do you believe that you are perceived as MORDAC, the preventer of information services by your organization? Nobody would admit it, right? But a brave soul has admitted it this morning. I would submit to you that many of our organizations view the security team as MORDAC. We are CISO, right? That's what that means, right? And the joke here is, hey, we sometimes do things such in a vacuum that we don't understand the impact to the business, or at least understand, the pain points the business is having. And so the example is, hey, to log into this computer, stare directly at the sun. That's great, right? So I hope you enjoy the comic. So real quick, a little bit about me. I'm not going to do a deeper dive into this slide because I think Jeff did a great job introducing me. I've been doing security for a very long time. Since out of college, I started at NASA. And I came from an engineering background, right, which is interesting because becoming an engineer and doing security, I formed a very technical lens to the world. My measure of success for security was technical: firewalls, networks, forensics, DFIR, all of that good stuff. But as I progressed throughout my career, I learned there are other ways to measure security that are equally important, or sometimes even more important. But again, a little bit about me. I've grown a love for the high desert areas in the US. So the picture there you're looking at is Sedona, Arizona. So if any of you have a chance to visit the Southwest US, definitely visit Sedona. It's beautiful. I'm a foodie, so being in here in Singapore is great. Love being here in Singapore. I'm a Star Trek fan. Self-proclaimed Trekkie in the room. Next generation only. Sorry. Okay. All right. So like I said, I started out at NASA as an intern, and I started out as an incident responder. This is the team that gets called in when NASA gets hacked. So I had to piggyback investigations with the FBI, the Office of the Inspector General. And back then, we didn't have all these cool whiz-bang cloud tools. I actually carried around a suitcase with hard drive imaging kits, and I used Linux distros. And Jeff is nodding here because he knows all of these tools: the Coroner's Toolkit, Metasploit, Kali Linux, Knoppix. And you would have to take images of hard drives with DD and capture evidence and do ethereal captures. And all of that evidence has to have a chain of custody. You have to take it to court, testify, and prosecute the hackers, or the individuals. Sorry, the attackers, not the hackers, right? Because there are white hats too, right? So I spent 3 years doing this, and working in the government with the FBI and the Inspector General taught me a lot in terms of, hey, because we were government, we weren't profit-driven. We were research-based, we were government-based, so the goals of the government are very different than that of private industry. But where I came from is, I formed a very technical lens early in my career, and that, I would say, was a blessing and a curse throughout my career as I learned, hey, there are other ways of looking at security and how to measure security, right? So let's define the problem statement. Like, let's not talk in high in the clouds. Let's talk about what specifically we're addressing, right? So again, how do we know our efforts are making an impact to our organization, right? And why does this even matter? We often don't have time to ask these questions, but they're critically important. Why? Because if we don't, what's at stake is we waste millions of dollars in tech and man-hours, tech spend and man-hours. There's mistrust of the security team. Everybody familiar with the term ivory tower of security, where you set up such a big bureaucracy of security? It's a checklist of no, 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 no. And the business is just like, oh my God, security is an ivory tower. I do not want to deal with the security team. That's an ivory tower, right? What's also at stake is, we go into the boardroom and the CEO and the executives and we ask for a budget. How do we justify that budget? Because at the end of the day, the business needs to know, hey, there needs to be a return on investment on what we're delivering, right? And then finally, I would say probably the biggest risk is if we don't get this right, if we don't know if our efforts are making a difference, then there's increased cyber risk to the organization. which is what our main objective is, right? At all security professionals, right? Again, the challenges, right? Security is a risk management game. It's subjective, right? My opinion on what's high risk versus yours may be very different. It's not the same. So how do you make heads and tails? How do you come up with something that's codified, right? And finally, there are many ways to measure security. I can ask my sister, my dad, my cousin, my friends, and they will all give me different answers to the same exact question. Very difficult, right? So that's the problem statement. So I kind of want to start by sharing a journey that I had with all of you. My first presentation to my board. In 2014, I was asked, hey, we need to give a presentation to our board on what is the state of the security posture of the organization. So, you know, on the graphic here, this is meant to be an eye chart, by the way. So you're not meant to read these words, but if you can, be great. Again, these slides are made available after the presentation, so it'll be made available. But basically, what I did was I presented our security program. Here's what we do with firewalls. Here's our antivirus. Here's what we do with social engineering, patching, encryption, so on and so forth. And what I learned out of that first board presentation was I was off. It's way off, right? I went into the boardroom with a very security lens, technical lens, or even a manager of a technical lens, and I proceeded to say, hey, this is what the program is. You should be happy with it. We're doing good. But I didn't show any data. I didn't give any sense of, hey, did this move the needle? Where did we come from? Where do we need to get to? How do we measure that, right? And so some key takeaways that I would share with you today, right, with board members is board members are not technical. That's no surprise. Very smart leaders, business leaders. They understand risk. They understand the business. They understand the economics, but they are not IT. They're not security. So you have to be able to speak in that language and in terms that the board members will understand. 2, simple but very effective, is don't use acronyms, right? We are all heads down in our work. We use all sorts of acronyms. Don't expect people, even especially board members, to understand what MFA is, right? You got to spell it out. Simple but very effective. Number 3 is, and this is very key, the CIO and CTO often are dragged into the boardroom along with the CISO to speak on, hey, how are we doing with cybersecurity, right? So there is always a risk of adversarial relationships between the CISO and the CIO and CTO. I would push the other way. I'm saying, no, CIO and CTO are advocates. They are partners. They are stakeholders. They're not adversaries. The purpose isn't for the CISO to say, hey, CIO, CTO, these are all the bad things that are going on in your organization. You need to go fix it. So that sets up an adversarial relationship. So in the board presentation, we partner, the CISO and the CIO and the CTO. We partner in coming up with the presentation together to present to the board. So whatever problems we call out, there's a plan of attack, and how are we doing against that plan of attack, right? And then finally, I would say this is very important too, is board members are there to help. They have skin in the game. In the US, I don't know about in Asia, I need to check, but their board members have what they call fiduciary duty, meaning if the organization gets hacked or compromised, and it's found that the board members were not focusing on that risk area for the organization, they can be held liable. Right? And so they are there to help. You really use a board member to help. And then finally, I would say, after the first disastrous presentation I had to the board, I walked up to one board member and I asked him, hey, his name was, I won't use his name, but I asked him, hey, did I make sense? Does this presentation resonate? And he sat me down and said, hey, let's go have coffee, I'll talk to you. And he gave me all of these insights, and I would have never learned it, or it would have taken me a very long time to learn on the insights. But that one coffee conversation really taught me, oh, there's a very different lens that I need to start learning on how to present effectively to the board, right? So again, my first presentation. And then as you start trying to measure security, beware of the traps. This, again, is meant to be an eye chart. These are many of the logos like in the industry today. So I can't tell you how often I've come across security teams, including my own, where we start with the solution. We don't start with the problem. We start with the solution, and then we go search for problems to solve. It's a very easy trap to fall in, right? So I always reset. It's like, hey, no, what is the business problem that we're trying to solve? Then we go find the solution for it. Don't go the other way around, right? Second, security checkboxes and ivory tower, right? Security people always wired to, hey, what are the security checks? It has to be reviewed. We have to approve it. Then we can send it on its way. But we don't often realize that doing so slows down the business, adds friction, right? And the more processes and the more gates that we set up, there's more friction to the business. And we often don't weigh that heavily in our selection of how we're going to design something. So it's very important. So watch out for the ivory tower. And then each logo you add to your security program will add a bit of technical debt. There has to be people manning the helm. There has to be new processes around this new technology. There's a cost to technology. There's a cost to any logo that you deploy. So I would advise, not only the CISO, but all security leaders say, hey, if I'm going to implement something, what is the cost of doing business with that something? The people cost, the process cost, the man hours, and the impact to the business, right? So I would say beware of the traps when you go and embark on, hey, this is what we're going to do in our security program, right? So let's go to the foundations, right? These are the key 5 things that I've learned that helped me the most in terms of how do we go about measuring security, right? Number 1, know your audience. I know it's anecdotal, but it's very true, right? You just got to know your audience. The example is the board presentation that I did. Number 2, critical, super critical. Don't start with metrics. It sounds counterintuitive, but do not start with metrics. Start with the business objectives. You may be a hospital, a government agency, a commercial company in e-commerce, a mobile, whatever you are, you have business objectives. Start with that. And then say, this is our business. This is how we generate revenue. This is what we're providing to the industry. What are the cyber risks to that business? Whether or not you're in the cloud, you're in the data center, your user base, your customer base, what are the risks to that business? If you start with the business objectives and the risk around those objectives, then that will inform you what the metrics should be, not the other way around, right? Number 3, Jeff said it. You can't say you're successful if you can't measure it, right? So you need to quantify what success means in security in numbers, not anecdotes, not qualitative statements, not none of that. You have to be able to measure it and repeat it, right? 4 and 5 are I think foundational as well. They underpin your success, which is, hey, security, is it just owned by the CISO? Is it just owned by the security team? It's a shared responsibility, right? Engineering, IT, even teams outside of IT, like procurement perhaps, needs to own some part of security processes, right? So it literally it takes a village to secure an organization, not just a security team, right? And in so doing that, to get over the hump of he said, she said, and expectations, set up a RACI chart. Who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, and who's informed, right? It's an exercise that many security engineers like me don't like doing, but it's critically important because it sets the expectations up front with you and your stakeholders on who owns what. Very important. And then finally, number 5 is very critical. And this is something I'm very passionate about, is whoever is accountable, meaning the buck stops there, has to be empowered, right? If you don't pair accountability with empowerment, you're setting it up for failure, very, very clearly, right? Okay, so I apologize. This is half an eye chart, but I kind of want to, if you look at this slide, just focus your attention to the first row, the lens. This is my attempt at kind of, articulating how certain layers of the security organization view the world, right? For example, the security engineers, their lens is, what were the number of attacks that made it past our firewall? Simple question, right? Managers and directors of InfoSec, were any of the attacks successful? Were we able to detect and respond to those attacks? The CISO will come along and say, what were the impact to the business? What have we done to prevent further breaches? What else is needed? But guess what the CEO and board will ask? Did we lose money? Did we suffer brand and reputation damage? Will there be lawsuits? Very, very different questions, all equally important, right? And so what they care about and the metrics that are attached to what they care about, I listed there as an example of the differences. But the point here is you see that each layer of security leadership has its lens. And I think that's the key takeaway for me. I started from the very left, from the security engineer. I moved towards the right, where I'm a CISO today, right? And I see the same patterns with my teams in terms of how they lens success and failure versus how I view success and failures. And that's where top-down, bottoms-up meet, and then we have to come towards an agreement. So if you're an engineer, you're trying to influence up, right, from left to right. You're trying to say, hey, because the number of attacks detected on our firewall is so high, we need to invest in more, better technology in firewall. Whereas the CISO may say, how is that going to matter with our dollars or our downtime or our outage? It's such a gap to make that connection, right? So instead, I would advise this for security engineers, especially more junior towards more senior, is the influence arrow is wrong. It should be this way. It should be from right to left, right? So the trick here is if you're a security engineer, learn or at least understand what the CISO and the board, what their questions are, and how you can, fill the gap of what you're doing versus what those questions are, because you know those questions up front, right? So influence, from the CEO and board down, the business down, and don't try to influence up. You'll find that it's much less frictional. Okay. Again, if I forgot, I apologize. There's time for questions at the end. So if anybody in the room or online would like to ask questions, we'll have time for that as well. Okay. Okay. So how do we do this, right? Remember I said we start from business objectives, then we go to a risk register. So I apologize. This is, for those of you in the back, very hard to read. Again, the slides will be made available. But here what I did was I plotted an example risk register, top 10 risks for the organization, plotted on the right. The right is your classic definition of risk, impact by likelihood. So the quadrant in the upper right are the immediate action required, the most critical things that you want to do, right? So for example, in this example risk register, I called out 3 top risks: ransomware, security patching or lack thereof, and production data in non-production environments, right? Let's say those are your 3 top risks that you want to tackle, okay? You've identified the risk register. And again, the risk register has to be mapped to the business objectives, right? Whatever your business objectives are. This risk register is mapped to this fictional business that I'm sharing with you today, right? But let's say these are your 3 risks, right? Here's how I would recommend coming up with metrics, right? We talked about it. Engineers, managers, directors, CISO, CEO, and board members have different lenses to security, right? So you're plotting the risks in the rows and the metrics in the y-axis, in the columns, right? So these are some of the examples. I'm not going to go into all of these. You can read kind of the examples of what a tactical metric may be versus the strategic, right? But the point is you want to be able to measure it. Put a number against it. Don't use anecdotes. Don't use qualitative measures, right? And the trick here is you want to define what your risk tolerance is. The number will never be 0 or 100, but maybe that's not what the business needs. Maybe what the business needs is between 90 and 80, for example, right? So if you take this lens into how you measure security and understand that, hey, if my audience are the engineers, managers, and directors, I would go with the tactical metrics. And if my audience are the CISOs, the CEOs, and the boards, I would go with strategic metrics. I think you get a lot more traction, right? Again, I think, two takeaways here is always make sure you're able to quantify what the metric is, whether or not it's tactical or strategic. Some of these are very hard to measure. For example, how do you attach a dollar loss to an incident? Very hard, right? Cost of forensics, cost of investigations, cost of man hours from HR, from PR, from InfoSec, and so on and so forth. But you still should attempt to measure it, because if you don't measure it, you don't know how you're doing against it at all, right? And I think the trick here also is to plot the risks against the time, right? How are you doing this quarter versus next quarter? How did you do last quarter? Is this improving? When you bring this into the boardroom, the CEO or even the CFO, you're bringing, hey, here's where we were. It's either gotten better or it's gotten worse. You're able to tell a story. There's a narrative. You're not lost in the woods anymore. It's like you're just sharing one data point without any context, which is very hard, right? So don't underestimate the power of plotting these metrics against time and telling that story, whether or not it's a good story or it's a bad story. You're just showing facts and data, right? Okay. So now what? Did we solve the problem? Right? I would submit to you that if we have a risk register, that's our North Star, and we were able to define what the metrics that are attributable to each of those risks, tactical or strategic, based on our audience, we're now able to remove wasteful spend, right? Because once you have your metrics defined, your security roadmap should be aligned to those metrics. All the projects, all of the investments, all the logos that you're going to go buy and set up processes are in service to meeting those metrics. So you're able to remove waste, right? Increase mistrust with security. You've broken down the ivory tower. The risk register is public information. The metrics are public information. In fact, they're not only public, they're shared to the board and the management. So every single team in the company knows what your goals are, and it's been signed off. It's been presented to the board. This isn't something security is cooking in the kitchen in a silo. This is what the company needs to do, right? So what that will do is it will notify other teams that, hey, this isn't a security thing, it's a company thing. So that breaks down the ivory tower, right? Again, helps drive budgets and hiring. Budgets and hiring are super critical for security. A lot of times, I know that I'm a CISO and I'm always like, hey, I need more heads, I need more budget, I need more resources. But the question from the CFO always comes back as, show me where the need is. How do you quantify the need? What is really the need? And I struggle if I come with an answer that's anecdotal or qualitative. If I show the risk register, our metrics, and how we're doing against our metrics, either I don't need the budget because we're doing great, or we're doing so horrible, say, yeah, this is blinking red, we need to throw money at this, right? So again, it really helps drive your budgets and priorities. And if you get the first 3 bullets right, guess what? Your organization's cyber risk has decreased. Now you're actually achieving your objective in your role, wherever that role may be, right? The challenges, do we address the challenges, right? Security is a game of risk management. Well, the time that we took to define the risk register and translate the register to metrics demystified the subjectiveness of this. It's clear, it's quantified, you can measure it, right? We have prioritization in the risk register. What is the top 3, top 5, top 10 things that we're going to go fix this year, right? And then, finally, I would say this. The last bullet of many ways to measure security. I can't emphasize enough in my own experiences in learning with the board, with running teams, with building teams, with, know your audience. When you walk into a room and you're presenting to the CFO or a vendor or a partner, you just got to know your audience and speak to them in terms and metrics that they would understand. That's the biggest That's the biggest learning I've had in my career in terms of demystifying things and removing friction. Because people, even if they don't understand something, they would normally nod and understand, and you walk out of the room thinking, hey, I got my point across, everybody gets it. Not so the case, right? So I think it really helps us as security professionals to recognize audiences are different. They have different lenses. Different metrics are meaningful to different people at different layers of security, but also different layers of management, right? So we have to recognize and communicate in that framework, okay? So recapping, I think I repeated myself, but I will close out by saying, number 4 and 5, right? For all this to work, you really need a RACI. You really need to define who's accountable at the end of the day. For example, patching. Is the CISO responsible for that? Is the CIO responsible for that, for the IT systems? Is the CTO responsible for that, for the engineering systems? Who is accountable for that risk to the organization at the end of the day? Without a RACI, I may think as a CISO, the CIO owns that. It's not my problem. But the CIO said, no, you're the security leader. You own patching. If we don't talk or put this down, we have misaligned expectations, right? So RACI is very critical. If all this is going to work, you got to have a RACI, right? And then with the RACI, once you know who's accountable, they have to be empowered, right? Empowered means, do I have the authority to achieve my objective of patching, for example? Do I have the budget? Do I have the process? Do I have the people to achieve? Right? So you got to pair accountability with empowerment. So finally, I would say, sharing a quote from Albert Einstein, a person who never made a mistake, never tried anything new. This is something that I'm passionate about because, security people, we're risk averse by nature. We don't like mistakes. We don't like, because one of our mistakes can be a huge incident, right? But I'm more of, hey, we got to try new things. We got to be bold, right? Especially around things like this where maybe it's not comfortable, maybe you have cultural challenges within your organization. Some organization can turn on a dime. They can go to this model quickly. Others will take a year or more because of bureaucracy, politics, processes, whatever. But I would say don't let that detract you from pushing towards this model. Throughout my career, I've talked to a lot of other CISOs in my network, and the common theme that I always see, always, without exception, is all of us are dealing with some level of challenges in this paradigm, meaning the measuring of security. How do we communicate to our board, our leadership, our owners, our shareholders that we're moving the needle with security? It's always some layer of that, right? And so this is what I've learned throughout my career. I hope it has helped you, give you some thoughts and ideas on how you can measure security more effectively in your organizations. And at this point, I would be happy to take any questions. Any questions online? Let me know. Otherwise, in the room, if you have any, please.
No. Thank you, George. There are no questions from our virtual audience.
Okay.
Hi, I'm
We have a question here.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Simon Sherwood. I'm a reporter for the Register. I'm just wondering, really great stuff there. Which of the tactics that you've discussed today have you found most useful in your new role and in response to what sort of challenges? Because, it's a fast-growing organisation. You've got the merger happening. There's a lot going on. You've got expansion happening.
Mm. Are you talking about my particular organization today? Okay. So I would say it this way. We have our share of challenges like any other organization, right? We have multiple teams that we're trying to bring together, right? And there's always going to be challenges around that. So I would say it this way. Our approach is pragmatic. What we do is we identify the areas of commonality. For example, InfoSec, right? InfoSec for Gojek, GTF, and Tokopedia. I'm assuming you're asking about my organization, right? Each of us our risk registers may be different, which means our North Stars are different, right? But some of those risks may be the same or very similar. Well, if they're similar, the next question becomes, can we use our existing technology and process to manage that risk, to mitigate that risk? And some of it does, right? And so that's low-hanging fruit. So we actually do the analysis and circle the ones that we can consolidate, and those are the ones that we will consolidate and work together on. For the other ones, maybe we can in a quarter or 2 quarters, and then the last bucket is the stuff we can't. So bottom line, at the end of the day, it's really just an iterative process. The approach, I think you're asking about the approach. The approach is exactly that, is identify where there's commonality on your North Star, which is your risk register, because patching is almost ubiquitous. Everybody deals with patching, right? And maybe that's an example where the technology that you use and the process that you use can be merged together, including the teams, right? It doesn't make sense to have 2 different teams doing 2 different silos. Maybe it's one team patching it all, and now you can move staff around and give them stretch assignments and things like that. I'll be honest, it's a challenge, but it's something that we are currently working on in progress very passionately about.
Okay, so have you started merging those teams?
I'm sorry?
Have you started merging teams across the different units?
Slowly,
Yeah, okay.
yes. Slowly but surely, yep.
Thank you.
Sure. We have another question.
George, thanks for the presentation. I get what you're saying about start with the business objectives before defining the metrics. It's kind of a tactical thing, but do you have any advice around sort of the quick wins or low-hanging fruit in terms of metrics? Things like, I don't know, number of vulnerabilities or mean time to fix. There must be a common set of metrics that, you know, regardless of the business objectives that you would use.
Great question. Thanks, Lawrence. You know, when you asked that question, probably the first thing that popped in my mind is, by show of hands, how many of your organizations have challenges with phishing and social engineering? Virtually everybody in the room, right? So one of the things we do is we phish our users every month. Every month, we offer Starbucks gift cards, we offer iPhones, we offer coupons, we offer free rides, whatever, right? And we measure the amount of times the user falls victim by clicking on the link, and more insidious is if they give up their username and password. And so that's something that's not hard to do, investment-wise or process-wise. But if you're able to measure that and do security awareness training, onboarding training, or, I don't know, set up a wall of shame where you put the numbers of, the names of victims on a wall, and that drives down your phishing susceptibility percentage, that to me is an example of a low-hanging fruit. That's something that everybody can do. It's not a technical solution. You don't have to code. You don't have to go buy $1 million tool to do that. But that applies to almost everybody in the room, right? Whether or not you're a hospital, a bank, a government agency, right? So that would be a low-hanging fruit, right? Yeah. Any other questions? We have a question here.
Hey, George, great presentation. Really good stuff. Hey, a little bit of different angle from the last question. What's the high-hanging fruit? In your experience, what's the hardest stuff you've encountered to quantify, to measure, to drive?
Ooh, great question. So I would say I have a different bias. I'll be honest. My opinion of this is biased. I don't believe in my mind the challenge isn't so much the security problem per se. It's more about ownership. For example, Lawrence works for Sneak, right? And Sneak helps the engineering team remove vulnerabilities throughout their software development lifecycle as they code, making sure that open source libraries are free of vulnerabilities and so on and so forth, right? Who owns that? If there is a vulnerability in your product, who owns that at the end of the day? Is it the CISO? Is it the CTO? Is it the engineering team? Is it the InfoSec team that pen tests that app? Who is it? So my point there is there are solutions and technologies, and you can stitch processes to those things, but deciding who owns it, codifying the ownership of it, and then putting that into practice is a lot harder, right? So that's my first answer to you, kind of. So before the problem, fix the ownership problem first before the technical problem would be my first answer. Technical problem-wise, I would say this. Probably, I would answer with a theme is insiders, right? Insider threats, meaning all of us have users in our organization. They already have access to our systems. What happens if they turn rogue? What process or systems do you have in place to detect, prevent, or even detect that? Very, very hard problem to solve. There are technologies, you can use UBA, acronym, right? User behavior analysis, and all these whiz-bang ML and AI. But at the end of the day, it's a very hard problem to solve. A technical challenge, right? Is how do you manage the insider threat cyber attack vector? Hope that helps. We have another question.
Yeah, my name's Chad. So I get that it's extremely useful for CEOs to see metrics that allows them to compare different priorities. And in some contexts, the number of attacks that make it through the firewall, I guess, was your example. You could maybe come up with some metrics. But like when I think about my, like the things that I would like management to invest in, I really don't see how I'm going to come up with a metric for like, okay, there's this particular thing that an insider could do and it would cause this problems. Nobody has ever done that before, but I still think it needs to be addressed. And besides coming up with a number of like, there are 100 insiders that could do this, it seems, any number that I would ascribe to it is just going to be kind of made up and not really worth using as a decision-making tool. So how does one communicate like a binary question of our infrastructure is vulnerable to this or not?
Yep, great question, great question. I think your question is that challenge is shared across all of us here in the room, right? And the tool that I think helps with answering that is your risk register. Because when you show the CEO and the board the risk register, they either agree with you or don't agree with you. If they agree with you, then we need to do something about everything in the top right quadrant, right? So in your discussion with your CEO or leadership, if you're plotting a risk that's in the upper right, that means by definition, it's a high likelihood, meaning the risk is high, this bad thing is going to happen. And the impact is high, which means it's going to cost us a ton of money. What are we doing about it? How are we measuring against that risk, right? So I would say start by plotting this, right? And getting consensus within your organization, CISO, CIO, CTO, whoever, that can help you, that understands the risk, but also can ally with you. Show this to the CEO and the board, and if the business leaders agree this is a risk, then that's how you drive for investments. Does that help?
Hi, George. We have a question from our virtual audience, Xiang Jun.
Okay.
The question goes, how can a security engineer be trained to present effectively to a CEO? A junior security engineer would probably not have enough experience to shift their thinking this quickly.
That's not an easy answer. I don't have a silver bullet for that. I think, what I would do, just a good question. For me, mental question is, if I had to do it all over again, what would help me move faster to get to resonance? Right? How do I resonate? I would say you got to iterate, meaning however uncomfortable you are as a security engineer, even if you're starting out, you got to attempt to learn this side of the fence, not just bits and bytes and firewalls and source code all day long. You got to understand, how do I fill that gap between what I care about and what I'm passionate about versus what the CEO cares about? Start learning about that. And there's not one book that I would say you can go read and magically this will happen. It's iteratively just trying these things out. And you're going to have meetings like me with my board where it didn't go well, but every failure is a success, right? So you just got to iteratively learn and go. But what I would say is don't be fearful. You got to do it, because one of the things I also learned is it's better to be the voice of contrarian versus just being quiet about it. Even if you know something's bad, the CEO is not gonna, come down hard on you. It's actually, they are gonna appreciate you by calling out something that you think is truthful because you back it up with what you believe in, right? So no secret answer, no secret, silver bullet to the answer on this one, but don't let that detract you from pushing. Do it iteratively. Learn as much as you can and try to fill that gap. And the best tool is to actually put yourself in the hot seat and present to the CEO. There's no better way to learn by jumping in the deep end of the pool. Question here.
Hi, great presentation so far, by the way. I just want to ask any tips on changing security culture within an organization, and whether that's at the board level in some points. You mentioned places like North America, perhaps, that transition has already happened. Maybe even regulators are pushing it in some industries. That's not the case all over the world, though.
Yep.
So even from the board level, back down through the management, and then down to the individual IT and engineering teams who are maybe, I know you sort of mentioned creating your RACI chart, but you might say, hey, you're accountable for this right now. And they're like, no, that's your problem, mate. I don't want anything to do with it. So any kind of tips, I guess, from your experience?
I do. I think all of us have one time in our lives have tried security champions and mixed success and all that. I'm an advocate of that, but I would say where I've seen the biggest needle movement to that is you do a war game exercise, but you do it at the board level. You're saying, board level, in the next board meeting, ask your general counsel or whoever the secretary is, hey, I would like to do a war game exercise with our board members. I like to simulate a data breach, a ransomware attack, something, right? And let that roll. You either do it yourself or you hire a third party to come in. And you'll find that as they go through the exercise, light bulbs start picking up. Oh my God, who's gonna talk to the media? Who's gonna wake up the CEO? Who's going to tell the market that we're down for 3 days, right? These super important questions come out, and that is the biggest instant recognition of the gravity of the problem, of the risks. So I would say, you can't just tomorrow go, hey, I'm going to do a cybersecurity exercise with my board. You want to build up to it, right? But I think in my career, I've seen where that exercise moves the needle the most. And I would say, after we did that exercise in my previous organization, I had 100% of my board members come up to me to say, George, this is so eye-opening. I've learned so much. How can I help you? 100%. Yeah.
We have another question from our virtual audience, Andy. Would you please share your top 3 effective metrics?
Ooh, that's a hard one. Remember, I have to know my audience first. My top 3 metrics for the board versus my top 3 metrics for myself or my staff, different. So I'm going to cheat a little bit and say this way. Please refer to my slides on what. So in my slides, when I drew out the examples of the metrics, right? These are the ones that are top of mind for me. So you can say these are my prioritized ones as an example for each of these layers. Cool.
Hey George, Indrani here. I have a question for you, a bit more practical. I want to understand from your experience, have you ever faced a situation where there's a distrust with the board? Either it's from your predecessor or, whatever that happened in the organization as you were taking on this role. How do you then bounce back and regain control, build the trust back with the board?
You're saying, Indra, the trust from you to the board or the board on you as a CISO?
Security as a whole.
Got it. So I actually haven't had an experience like that, so I can't speak to it firsthand. But I can kind of tell you what I would do in that situation, right? If you're succeeding a previous leader that has no trust from the board, I think the first thing I would do is, kind of my example, is I would pull 1 or 2 board members aside individually and have a heart-to-heart. Say, please, top of your mind, please, just be honest. What is the problem? What is it? Is it a communications? Is it lost in the woods? Is it we got hacked so many times we can't remember anything anymore? Like, understand truly what the problem is, and based on that, those conversations, build my risk register, build my metrics backwards, right? I wouldn't do that in a big forum because people won't be honest or share everything with you. But in that example, I would literally say, hey, please, can we go have coffee? And I just want to, be a sounding board for you on what you think the biggest issues are with security. The board members as well as the CEO, and then I won't stop there. I'll go down to my stakeholders, the CIO, the CTO. So then you start building a picture. Each area of the business will have a lens on what the problem is. Some of them may be the same, some of them may be different, but then in the end, because you're new, you have the benefit of raw data. You don't have hopefully any politics or anything yet, right? Then once you have that full picture, then you can map your line of attack.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Another question.
Thank you. Great session, George. Thank you very much. When you showed the risk register earlier, and following on from the question from the gentleman earlier as well, you talked about the top right quadrant. Do you see more kind of the bottom right coming in as well? So even though the likelihood might, maybe it's the other way around, but even though the likelihood might be very low, if the impact is going to be very high, then there's still a need to mitigate that risk. So do you see more of that coming in?
Absolutely. So you're saying for the top left quadrant, right? Low likelihood, but high impact. That quadrant, by the way, is probably the most controversial, meaning so many opinions are saying, no, it shouldn't be top left, it should be top right, or it should be top, bottom right, right? So I would say anything that has high impact, which is the top half of the graph, warrants a lot of scrutiny. Yeah. So just because if your question is just because it isn't the top left, should we not focus on it? Absolutely not. Yeah. Absolutely not. Right? Those bubbles move. They move week over week, quarter over quarter. So this is just a snapshot in time. Right? So I would say yes, there should be an action plan behind 6 and 7 on this chart as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Great point. Please. Oh, time for one more question. Thank you, Jeff. Any other questions? Going once, twice. Thank you, everybody. I really enjoyed my session this morning. I appreciate your time. Enjoy Black Hat Asia, everybody.
Fantastic job. Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, George. This evening, 4:20 in this room, it's going to be my privilege to have a fireside chat with Chris Inglis, the first National Cyber Director for the United States government. And so we're going to discuss some of the topics I brought up yesterday at the keynote. It's going to be kind of a conversation, but it is going to be incredibly unique to have access to someone at that level of experience, that level of sort of national policy and insight into what's going on in the world today. And so I hope you'll join me for the conversation at the end of the day, 4:20 in this room. All right. With that said, thank you very much for attending the first session of the day on day 2 of Black Hat, and I'll see you around. Thank you.